Hello, my name is Tom Foley. I'm the president of Mount Aloysius College, and I want to welcome you to another in our series of Digital Grotto Conversations. We are joined today by two very interesting people that I'll introduce in just a moment. I want to let you know that this is our year of authentic discourse at Mount Aloysius. We're going to focus on what that phrase means, and we may even aspire to practice it when we finish the year. This follows on some years in which we focused on things like the common good. What is it? How do we pursue it? The good life. Very similar questions. The last 2 years we focused on voice. How do we develop one so that we can pursue the good life and maybe practice and find the common good? It seemed natural to us to work on the authenticity of our discourse in these days and times in our country, and that'll be our focus this year. Today's conversation is going to focus in many respects on that idea of authentic discourse. And we're joined by two people who practice it in their lives and in their professions. Carolyn Donaldson is well known in central Pennsylvania. For 20 years, she was the lead anchor in our local news. I know Carolyn more from all the work that she has done in community over those years. No matter what the organization, she always volunteered her time and her talents to them. Carolyn is also, as of this coming board meeting, a member of the Board of Trustees at Mount Aloysius College. And she now works I guess I'll summarize it as public radio and TV, working with the WPSU station in this region. Our special guest today is also the speaker at the Mount Aloysius 2017 convocation. He is Dr. Michael Patrick Lynch. He is a philosopher by training. He has taken a special interest in truth, technology, democracy, and civil discourse. He's the recent recipient of major grants, interestingly from foundations on all sides of the political spectrum, who believe that the kind of work he is doing at the University of Connecticut, where he directs the Humanities Institute, is as important as we think it is here at Mount Aloysius College. So we're glad you're able to join us today for this digital grotto conversation on authentic discourse. And I'd like to turn now to our moderator, Carolyn Donaldson.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Lynch, for joining us. I'll call you Michael from here on, if that's okay. We'll be informal in this discussion. With your multiple books, with your TED Talks that have reached now, your TED Talk, recent TED Talk, 1.5 million views and growing, your hypothesis hits right on this target of authentic discourse. And so I'd like to begin our discussion with a little bit more about that part of the TED Talk, where you summarize and say the more we read and watch online, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between what's real and what's fake. It's as if we know more but understand less. That is some big thinking. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. I think one of the things that we all experience right now in our daily lives is not just being overwhelmed with information, but actually just swimming in information in a way that's actually become comfortable for us. It used to be that we thought we were overwhelmed. I thought, sometimes still feel that way. But I think for many of us now, we've become used to receiving information from a variety of sources, often competing. Variety of television, of course, has become preceded as, in many people's minds, as the primary access. It still is for others. Sure. But right now, I think that familiarity with this sort of sea of information has meant that sometimes we're forgetting that that information impacts what we think we know and what we believe in a variety of different ways, in ways that we sometimes don't have time, it seems, to pause and examine. And one of the ways in which I think this feeds into the paradox that sort of informs my recent thinking and informs that TED Talk is that while we seem to have access and certainly share more information with each other than ever before, we have friends all over the world thanks to Facebook. The level of discussion has become more polarized and less authentic. in a sort of obvious way that, I think most people will sort of naturally sort of resonate with. So I think that's that sense, a sense that I think is pretty common to all of us now, that it seems like things should be less polarized, given how much we're sharing with each other.
Right, we've got that information.
But why is that not the case?
Okay.
So that's the puzzle that's been informing my recent work, or one of the puzzles.
Okay, so when we look at all of that information that's coming to us, and I think you typify it as a bubble, or almost inside that bubble of information. Can you explain why, as how that relates to technology today, and how we're accessing that information?
Right. So what's different, I think, about how we access information now is how personalized our access is. When we used to go back in the day to libraries and things of that nature to open up newspapers, newspapers were not personalized per the reader. It was to a general audience. Now, and this is one of the great things about the internet, it doesn't just get me more information. That's not the magic of the internet. The magic is it gets me precisely the information I want or think that I want. Everything that I read, from the ads online to the news that comes down my Facebook or Twitter feed, that's all personalized for my particular preferences. And this is why when I want to seek information online, it seems as if Google is particularly good at this, at finding exactly what I want. And indeed, much of the commerce online is geared at getting people to actually predict what it is that we want. And I'm very good at that. Now, why is that a problem? Well, because look, information I'm getting is personalized, so it fits what I want. But of course, what I want and what's true are often different things. It tends to inflate our bubbles, our information bubbles, rather than bursting them. And that, I think, is one of the problems that is leading us to that paradox that we're in now, the personalization of information. A good thing, yet also, in some ways, not so good.
Good point. When we talk about the notion of daring to know the truth, so getting beyond that bubble that we exist in for our information and how it's data mined for our personal preferences,
Right.
and especially related to the college campus here and Tom's involvement in getting the students to think authentically,
Right.
how can we make some of those things change for us and for students on a campus like this?
One thing I think we need to remember is that there's a difference between what we might sort of passive knowing and what I'd call active understanding. I mean, this is an old distinction. It goes back to Kant, and I'm sure much before him. Kant had this phrase that he thought summed up the Enlightenment, saper aud, and this Latin phrase that he glossed as daring to know for yourself. And that's something that we've always encouraged in education. Any good educator is trying to encourage their students to, learn something for themselves. That's more of a struggle, of course, when we can get the information we want or we seem to want so quickly and so passively in the ways that all of us, including myself, do it all the time. And again, I want to emphasize, nothing wrong with Google knowing. I mean, I do it all the time, like everybody else. It's my go-to, my default. That's the first thing I go to in order to know anything, right? But that fact sometimes gets us, the ease of it, gets us to overlook these more active ways, riskier ways of knowing. And those ways of knowing are often are not the sort of ways that we're going to engage in when we're just downloading a set of facts. If we're interested in why something happens, why a disease spreads, or how a mathematical proof particularly works, or why our friend is depressed, online information, including the information we get from our friends online and social media, can be really helpful with those things. They can teach us all sorts of things. But if it's something new, if it's something particular, and think about the examples that I gave, all right? They're very different sorts of examples. But if take the last example, my friend who might be depressed. Yes, information is going to be helpful online. But in order to really understand what's going on, I might have to talk to them, all right, personally, or have them talk to a therapist. It takes a little bit more of active imagination. Or take the mathematical proof. You can be told the answer, but any good teacher of mathematics from college all the way down will tell you that to really understand it, we all know this from personal experience, you've got to work through it yourself. Sometimes not that much fun for somebody, but actively risking the possibility that you could be wrong is super important. Super important.
You talk in the book about receptive versus intellectual knowledge. And I think that's something that's very interesting for our students, because I don't think I've really had to deal with what is the difference.
Right.
And you give some great examples in the book as well, in terms of really understanding how something works. Could you say a little bit more about that distinction?
Sure. So I think, as I said, I think that what I call in the book Google knowing, that is the sort of knowing we do online, that we're pretty familiar with and how that works. I think what we often don't notice is that it's become, as I was hinting at earlier, so integrated that it's a little bit like perception for us now. So we used to say, put it this way, we used to say that seeing is believing. Now Googling is believing. And I mean, if you think about it, that's really the case. How many times have you been in some dispute? It might be over some small matter of fact with somebody, and pretty soon the phones come out. Right? And we're in a race to see who can, it's annoying, but, of course, none of us would ever do that. But, but it actually, it is pretty common. So it's part of our life, Google knowing. The difference is between that and, the more active ways of understanding have to do with two factors. One, when we're more actively engaged in pursuing this type of thing I call understanding, we're often pursuing reasons. We're looking for reasons why, reasons how. And to pursue reasons is to pursue considerations that might lead us to think that something's true or something's false, that might overturn our particular beliefs. And that sort of active use of irrationality is something that, of course, is incredibly important. And isn't always there when we're just, let's say, looking at something or passively receiving, downloading information. And then more than that, I think, is, and most importantly, is that when you're really striving to understand something, you have to have that initial moment of coming to understand it. After we've understood something, it can return to a sort of a passive thing, like the things that all of us deeply understand about whatever it is, subjects that we might have real knowledge of. That gets sort of hardwired into us after a while. But there always is that first moment of actively sort of seeing, aha, that's how that fits together. That shows you that active understanding involves creative input.
Yeah.
It's a creative process. So actually learning something in this way, learning in the way that I'm talking about, is a creative process. We're all being creative. Yeah, just like, I'm a proud parent, and of course I'm really proud of my daughter when she was younger, of drawing, but look, Jackson Pollock had done it before, the scribbles. So, but for her, that experience was a sort of creative experience. Not creative historically, but creative for her. In the same way, coming to understand, something, think about a student might come to, or you might remember coming to understand why Lady Macbeth was washing her hands compulsively, and guilt. And that is not a titanic, deep insight into Shakespeare in any way, shape, or form of a historical nature. But when you first have it, it's a creative moment of connecting the dots. And those are simple examples, but they're the sort of examples that I think hopefully illustrate that that's the sort of more active type of understanding we want to work for. And the way to do that, which actually, Carolyn, is what you also were interested in, I think, earlier, and is just, if I understood you, was we need to encourage that sort of learning, I think, in our not only in our elementary schools, but in college and in our ordinary lives. We need to remind each other of the importance of this sort of learning. And that might sometimes require, although it's painful for me because I am a tech junkie, is to put the phone down and actually, pay attention to each other.
Listen.
Yeah.
The listening part of the component
Exactly.
is critical.
It is critical. And it's often the most difficult thing to do. Because to listen is to immediately put yourself in a place of vulnerability. It's to put yourself, to truly listen with somebody, to listen with your whole being, is to see yourself as part of a process with somebody else. And it's really listening means being open to the possibility that you might learn something. You know, too much of our communication nowadays is waiting for the other person to stop talking so you have your chance to talk. And, you know, I think part of that too is I text a lot. Texting is a sort of waiting for the other person to stop. You even have the little dots that tell you that, yes, they're still doing it. And you're like, well, yes, right, come on, so I can get my shot in, you know. And it's a great medium. That's useful. It's so useful for a variety of things. But it is also perhaps getting us to overlook the value of that sort of one-to-one sort of conversation we're having now.
Okay. If I could move you into how we and students work with some news organizations, because again, that's becoming much more of that infotaining, informational deluge that you see. And we talk with, we see news organizations and internet vehicles present obvious news biases. We can all agree on that point, but some have also tried very hard to strictly report what they call the facts. Mm-hmm. So how can we actually identify those sources using this new tool called authentic discourse when we're looking at that?
Right. So, great question. Practical question. Let me just back up one bit and just indicate that I really think that for me, I think we need to start with the thought that as difficult as it is to ascertain what the facts are in any situation, especially in any politically or emotionally tinged situation, we still have to, I think, remember that there are such things as facts, and there is such a thing as truth. I mean, that may become, given the way that some philosophers have talked over the last 30, 40 years, that may come as a surprise to your philosopher saying that, but I think it's a common sense point that we need to remind ourselves of, is the importance and existence of truth and the facts.
And that's why it's so important that people get it, that you're a philosopher, and yet you're all over this communication issue, because at the end of the day, it goes to the core of what you've spent your life studying, that there is such a thing as truth.
Exactly. Exactly. And right now, as we, I'm sure we'd all agree, our culture is in something of a troubled relationship with the concept of truth. So I think the first thing, as a philosopher, that is important for me to contribute to the conversation is to say, look, the arguments that people have given you, whether they're fancy philosophical arguments or arguments that you just hear online for doubting the existence of truth or facts, or thinking that it's all spin, which is tempting. I mean, it's sometimes you feel like, right, that the very existence of phrases like the no spin zone sort of suggests that you're in the spin zone, right? And that leads to cynicism of us, even with me in cases. But you've got to remember that at the end of the day, there is such a thing as truth. It's just hard to get to. So now to the practical question of how do we make discourse more authentic? Well, at the University of Connecticut, one of the things we're doing is we have 10 groups of researchers working on this project, and I'll mention some of the things that we're trying to do. So one thing that I think is important to do is to try to help redesign certain digital platforms. One problem, I think, with authentic discourse that or a problem facing the possibility of authentic discourse, is how online commenting works on news platforms. There's been a lot of work on this recently, but right now there's sort of a choice between editing, no editing, and that's more or less. There are variations in between those about how the editing is done. In other words, your YouTube, anybody can say anything, more or less, right? And so things tend to go south quickly. To the New York Times, which is, you post something, there's somebody actually reads it, might not get posted because of content and other sorts of issues. Right now, it would be interesting. One of the things we're working with, and with a group in England, and with folks in Silicon Valley, is to see whether some recent AI technology might help speed up some of the editing process. Now, there are dangers to that as well, because who designs the algorithms and so forth. But that's a small point. I mean, it might sound sort of even, sort of banal. Yes, it would be nice to get commenting platforms working in a more in a more constructive way. But if you think about how those platforms have been, especially in the last election, we saw the hijacking of certain platforms, including commenting platforms, by outside actors, including ones that were algorithms, essentially. Trying to figure out, and I'll segue into another thing, is trying to figure out how to stop that, all right? So that our online communication, which, as we're all agreeing, is, whether we like it or not, a major factor of our lives right now. How to manage that in a way that's more, and prevent intrusions and hijacking of it by those who might have, let's say, not democracy's best interests at heart, and do that in a democratic way. So those are two ways. I think another way to do it is right through. I think we're also working with secondary high school teachers to talk to them about how to design some of their courses in ways that allow them to talk about divisive issues, which is difficult to do at high school level for all sorts of reasons, in a way that brings out this concept we're interested in called intellectual humility. Where intellectual humility, we think, and there's been a lot of psychological and philosophical work on this, is the concept of being willing to see your own worldview as open to improvement by other people's experience. And so one of the things we're doing is working with high school teachers across the Northeast to see how to integrate this concept into some of their syllabi. And then we're studying the effects of that with social psychologists. And we'll see how that goes. So those are some practical things that we're working on at a variety of different levels. We'll see how they pan out. I mean, there are more general things that we can talk about, if you'd like, too, about how we might conceptualize our own individual experiences in authentic discourses that we hope to get involved in.
Mm-hmm. I think that might be a good segue. Could you broaden it out a little bit?
Sure,
just so that
absolutely.
people watching and being a part of today's
right.
engagement can say, here's a takeaway, or here's
Right.
a quick win that maybe I could myself consider.
Let's return to this notion of intellectual humility.
Okay.
I think the way I defined it is willingness to see yourself as your worldview as open to improvement by other people's experience. That's more than just being open to change. Lots of people work to be open to change. And it's also more than just being open to self-improvement. Self-improvement is a terrifically important thing. But there is a sort of, dare I say, fetishization of it right now in our culture. A sense that if only I will make myself better. I will give myself more esteem, and by virtue of that, have more esteem in my own perfection. That's a powerful thought and empowering for many people, and including myself. But that thought, the idea that self-improvement alone will allow people to engage in authentic discourse with each other is dangerous, because if there's a takeaway, the takeaway is we need to improve. We need to realize we improve from each other, not just by dint of our own genius and effort. Grit is super important in life, but grit that is having grit without having the openness to what other people's experience might be like, who are very different from your own, is grit and that is self-absorbed. And I think one of the things philosophically we need to wrap our minds around in this culture is the idea that we're in a community, we're sharing a common reality together. Right now, the idea that we actually share a common reality, I think is under threat in a lot of people's minds. It's not that we just, right now, it's not just that we lack common values. We think that the other people aren't even in the same world. They don't understand the facts. They're not sharing the same space with us. Or at least we can fall into that. Not everybody, of course.
Okay.
And I think that's a thing that the concept of intellectual humility, I think, is a way of trying to get into or start a path towards overcoming that sense of isolation from one another.
It's a little frightening, to be honest. I don't know. When you actually break it down that way. So common reality and the threat that we're facing now in light of everything, is there, how more do we bridge that then? How more do we come together with those polarization via technology and all the different ways we're getting this?
Well, one thing would be I think there's two levels at which we have to think of this. We have to think of it at the level of institutions and social practices, institutions like this wonderful college, and state government and federal government. These institutions need to play a part in rekindling this sense of intellectual humility. I think institutions can embody certain attitudes. Attitudes like civility, like open-mindedness, like perseverance and grit, those things. The institutional practices can embody those things. And we need to be careful and shape our democracy in ways that encourage the institutions that do that and perhaps discourage the institutions that steer us in other directions or practices that steer. So that's one level, and that's the sort of political level. On a personal level or philosophical level, I think it's important for each of us to try to reconnect with this value, the values of truth, the values of common reality, and really to start in our own lives. For me, it begins. As a professor in a university, I'm really blessed with being able to interact with people from all over the world and from students from a variety of backgrounds, and that is very helpful. But one thing I have to remember is, and I think it's really hard for a professor, a know-it-all, right, like myself, to remember, is that, while I may know more about Kant, let's say, than this particular student might be a war veteran and know a lot more about certain aspects of life than I do. Mm-hmm. And so even if his view is different, his or her view is different than mine on a particular, let's say, ethical or political issue, that that experience should be respected. And I think you see this in a variety of, what gives me hope is that I think a lot of folks are starting to see that each other's experience might need to be respected in a certain way. Not just your own experience celebrated amongst your own fellow travelers, but that, that we have to maybe respect what other people are bringing to the table as well.
Tom, is that a touch point on this entire authentic discourse that you're bringing to your student population?
That's probably the central point, that we don't know it all.
Right.
That it's important that we get beyond slogans, epithets on a placard, and thinking that a soundbite we heard on TV is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You talked a lot in your writings and in the TED Talk about basically deeper knowing, daring to know in Kant's terms. And that's our challenge in higher education, It's probably our challenge in all education. I personally, we were talking about our various children. I have 3 sons in their 20s, and I remember when they were growing up, I apologized to them often because they were confronted with so many more decisions so earlier than I ever was because of the abundance of communication at that time. Now we're at hyperspeed on these things. And you think back to Tom Paine writes Common Sense, at the founding of this country. There was definitely a polarization, when you read that, there were clearly some very, very different points of view about the best way forward for this country. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't at hyperspeed like it is now because of the factors that you isolate. And that's what we're trying to unpack, in a sense, for our students, to be able to slow it down for them, to think about what is knowledge, what is intellectual knowledge versus receptive knowledge, what is just getting some information off of Google versus really having knowledge that you can validate yourself. You know the source of that. And that gets right to where we just finished, where you're talking about absolutely polarized groups that have no understanding. And we see it here in Central Pennsylvania. How could that other group feel that at all? And that's our challenge. And I think, we'll spend a lot of time talking this year about what does it mean to be intellectually humble, as we do this. Because if we're not willing to listen to that perspective from somebody, might not be coming from a deeply intellectual background, but they have a life experience that can really inform where we go. But that is our challenge. Mm-hmm. If we say that higher education is about teaching critical thinking, it starts right here. Yeah. I don't know if you remember, and I'll finish with this. Alvin Toffler, 70s, writes a book called Future Shock. Right. And the huge takeaway for me at the time was his point that all the information that will be available at the time you die, so you live 70 years, all of that information, 97% of it, now he was writing in 1975, 97% of it will have been accumulated in your lifetime. So only 3% of all of whatever we call information existed at the time you were born in the 70s. Well, now it's 99.99999. And his point was the sheer abundance of information. Right. But you've taken that to another level. It's not the sheer abundance. It's that it's also profiled to what it looks like our particular orientation is.
And that's why it doesn't feel anymore like abundance as where we started out. I mean, which is, I think, really important for people to realize, is that it's not, the reason that we don't feel overwhelmed anymore is because the information we're getting is just, it's just exactly what I wanted. It's the restaurant's hours, or it's, it's
filtered for
right,
your
exactly.
specifications.
It's that story. Oh, that's exactly what I wanted to know about the hurricane. And so that can deceive us into thinking that somehow we're managing it, when in fact it's managing us. And that is a dangerous point when you add it to this polarization. I think you hit the nail right in the head. Polarization, as the historians will tell you, has a long and storied history in this country, as with others. People have been disagreeing with one another since there were people. So that's not surprising. And it was similarly nasty at the founding of this country. In fact, possibly even more so with the allegations that were heard back and forth between the founding fathers about their personal lives. But it took days for pamphlets to travel around.
To filter
people
out.
Yes, exactly. And so as a result, people were not reacting in real time. Mm-hmm. And that helped. That's no longer the case. And but I do have hope. I do think that people in Silicon Valley, some people at Google and Facebook that I've spoken to, and other organizations and corporations are sensitive to this, and that's good. I think and I think they're willing to partner with educators to try to figure out how to mitigate some of the damage of, frankly, some of their own platforms. Mm-hmm. So how we're going to do that is a puzzle. The first thing for any problem, though, of course, is to recognize that it exists, and to recognize that our ways of knowing now, which are so amazing, are feeding into sort of lack of knowledge in a way. Mm-hmm. And we have to navigate that. And it's a pressing problem for all of us.
And we need to be reminded all the time. I was reading one of your pieces the other day, and it isn't like it's the first time I thought of this, but it was great for me to be reminded that the information that I get when I'm looking up something, say, political, about, I'm getting information that's geared to things I looked at before. Yeah. So I'm not getting I have to actively seek out alternate viewpoints. They're not just turning up on my Google feed or,
Any of your
no.
social media.
It's already
your clicks
geared.
are predetermining.
Right, of course. And And that's how the magic happens on the internet, is the tracking of our behavior online.
And you guys are studying that, and that's a
We
big
are.
part of the work you're doing.
It is.
And
It
you're
is.
finding that the folks that are really at the top of this pyramid get it, and they.
Well, that's what I'm finding. I
Yeah.
mean, I think, of course, there's a complex world out there, and some people are less interested in assisting with these cultural problems than others. But I am hopeful that some of the projects that I mentioned that work at various levels, at the institutional, the technological, at the personal, the educational level, some of those attempts to try to bring a sense of intellectual humility and active knowing back into our national conversation, some of those will prove to be helpful. But of course, we don't know it all, and we don't know what's going to happen. But we can hope for the best.
If it's okay, Carolyn,
Sure.
I wanted to ask you another question that I think is very relevant for our students. And there's a line in one of your recent writings where you talk about the things that are happening right now, where we seem to have some extreme polarization in some areas. And you describe that as a symptom.
Yes.
And you say it's not the cause of a larger trend, but it's one that rewards dogmatic certainty and punishes those who acknowledge the possible limitations of their own point of view. And we're trying to encourage our students to look outward and consider their points of view, but they're living in a world where, at least right now, dogmatic certainty is what is rewarded.
Yeah, rewarded by those of us those who agree with us. Actually, rewarded in punishment. That's where it comes from. And that feature that you're talking about is really it's a symptom of a problem that exists for democracies in general, but it's a problem, which I'll describe in a minute, that tends to recede into the background sometimes, and then in other cases comes to the foreground. And we're in one of these situations where it's come to the foreground. What's the problem? The problem is that democracies can't function if they don't, on the one hand, have citizens that have conviction. An apathetic electorate is no electorate at all. Right. On the other hand, democracies also can't function if those citizens don't listen to each other's convictions, at least some of the time, or even just aspire to listen. Mm-hmm. The problem is humility and conviction, or open-mindedness and conviction, however you want to describe it, they can conflict in just the way Tom is describing. Because we typically think that, that if you are willing to listen to the other side or even show them some respect, you may, on a matter of great moral consequence, you're clearly not a true believer. You lack conviction. And we all feel the pull of that. I mean, there are times when I too feel like, I'm not particularly excited about listening to the convictions of Holocaust deniers, for example, or Nazis, right? I mean, there are points in which you think, well, this is okay. We've had enough examination on this issue, and I think we can move on now, right? So what I'm not saying is that we need to loosen up in our moral convictions. The puzzle is how we keep our moral convictions and yet manage a democratic life that encourages institutions that reward our listening or giving reasons rather than deliberating together. Doing what the Senate is supposed to be the best at doing, and often nowadays seems to be amongst the worst at doing.
That's what I was going to ask you. Can our political system work within what you're describing?
Well, I think as a lot of us think, there needs to be some structural changes. I think one of the things that political scientists, we work with the National Institute of Civil Discourse, which has been engaged in some very interesting research recently, where they're taking state representatives at the state level, from politicians at the state level from different sides of the aisle, bringing them together in groups with their peers from other states, and working through techniques of dialogue, basically putting them through a sort of camp of how to listen to each other. And then people from the state level, the graduates of, and not everybody wants to participate, but the graduates, both Republican and Democrat, for example, will then go on and lead these groups for the next group. That's an initiative again, National Institute of Civil Discourse, which I think is really to be applauded, because that's a sort of meat and potatoes, sort of get down there with folks at a certain level. And, of course, most of our representatives in the national government are going to come from state,
So it's
local
peer to
government.
peer.
Peer to peer.
Okay.
It's peer to peer. And that, I think that really matters because, as Tom knows better than I mean, working in, it's always the case. You want doctors or lawyers or professors to change their practices. You need to get them on board. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's true journalists. I mean, because you listen to those who have had similar experiences. So I think that's a sort of an example, and we've partnered with them on a number of other initiatives. We're supportive of their Revive Civility project. I think that's a sort of way in which we can intervene. There's also all sorts of wonky structural things that we could get into. It's a bigger question.
Beast to
Yes,
tackle.
right. How to fix politics.
Yeah.
Yes. How long do we have?
If you can do that for us, that's a whole
No, I'm
bigger-
afraid.
No, and it strikes me that we have to keep doing it.
Right.
To give you an example, back in the early 90s when Newt Gingrich took over as the Speaker of the House, and you remember there was some particularly uncivil things happened at the time. And believe it or not, I was part of an approach where the families of members of Congress were brought to Hershey, Pennsylvania, the entire families, for a long weekend. And they brought in people. The person that I helped bring in was a guy named John Hume, who was a legislator in Northern Ireland and a peace activist who helped eventually architect the peace there in 1999. This was in the early 90s, though. And the whole point was to bring somebody who came from an absolutely divided society and talk about how did you get these sides working. Now that was 20-some years ago, and that's my point about we have to keep doing that. We have to keep exemplifying it. And interestingly, the first year we picked a theme for this college was the second year that I was here, and the theme was the university's role in civil discourse. Right. We're doing a different thing, but civil discourse is a subset of what we're talking about this year. And
I think that's an absolutely key point, that when we're talking about renewing discourse, it's not renewing, that could make it sound as if we have to get back to this point of perfection, which we had at some point, which is never the case. As we were already talking about, this country was founded on discord. I mean, a war. And that's, so there isn't some perfect place we're trying to get back to, nor is there perfection that we're going to obtain. It's a constant process. And in a way, the fact that we think that politics can somehow be perfected at all is, right, it's once you say it, you think, well, that's sort of a crazy thought that I would have that thought. But we do fall into it. So it's a really good point. I mean, it's sort of like, it would be as if we thought, oh, we can just stop. I've got it all figured out now, right? I don't have to, improvement, whether by yourself or from others, is a constant process. So I think that's a key point, is that we have to do it over and over.
Intellectual humility then.
Exactly.
Right back to that.
That's right.
We have just a few minutes left, and I'd love to, again, kind of have you summarize specifically for the students, who are a part of this campus and really, with Tom's leadership, are delving deeper into this, which I applaud the college for, and wondering, what, again, takeaways maybe that you want people to take from your talk.
Well, what I'd love for people to take from the talk is the sense that we can actually navigate these tensions, the tensions between humility and conviction. I want people, and young people in particular, to have convictions. I want them to have moral convictions. I want them to be willing to stand up for what is just, what is right. But I also want them and me to be willing to work in a democratic common space where we can hope to work together, not just alone, to reach some better society. So that's the takeaway that I hope that people will have after the talk.
Thank you. Tom?
I would. I want to say two things at the end. One, I want to do a commercial for Dr. Michael Patrick Lynch, and anybody who's watching this, pull out some of his articles. They are really worth a read, and he lays out how we get to this point of civil and authentic discourse, and I think in very practical ways, and we appreciate your sharing that here. For our students, I want to say I heard three things that are part of authentic and civil discourse. One is listening. Listening is a big part of it. Two is research, and I use that in the broadest sense of the term, that we simply move beyond the epithets and the slogans, and we try to discern and find information for ourselves and make it part of our experience, whether we learn it from our classmates, or we learn it from a book, or we learn it from coverage that we see of particular things. But that research is part of this journey to authentic and civil discourse. And lastly, and most importantly, and I think this is a really profound contribution on your part, Michael, that humility is part of that. It is vulnerability, but it's much more than that, that we're willing to suppose that maybe we're not 1,000% right, and that we want to hear from another life experience. And those are the lessons that I hope our students take out of this, that it involves listening, it involves personal research, and it involves some sense of humility. And we appreciate you sharing that with us today. Carolyn, we appreciate so much your gifts of helping to carry this conversation.
Thank you. I learned a lot myself. I
at
try
Mount
to listen a
Aloysius.
lot.
Yeah. No. But thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.